Freeze! Stop there. Don't you dare take a step further, or else I will put you down now.
You are making a big mistake, and you are going to regret
A racist security officer threatened to vanish a black woman without any trace. Didn't know she is an undercover CIA and Delta Force. One word from me, and you could vanish without a trace. Security Officer Frank Coleman snarls at the well-dressed black woman blocking his federal building entrance. The woman remains motionless, her expression unreadable as she reaches into her purse. She produces an identification card, extending it with steady fingers. Frank snatches it, studies it for a second, then tosses it to the floor with a cruel smirk. "Pick it up," he commands, watching as she slowly bends to retrieve her ID. "I don't care what fake credentials you have. This is a secure federal facility." He gestures to a small table beside the security checkpoint. "Empty your purse. Everything." His eyes flick dismissively to other employees, all white, who stream past without inspection. The woman methodically removes each item, arranging them with precision. But Frank has no idea that making people disappear is exactly what she does for a living, and she's exceptionally good at it. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue. The autumn morning painted Atlanta's skyline in shades of amber and gold, but Frank Coleman saw none of its beauty. At 52, his weathered face bore the permanent scowl of a man who'd spent the last 15 years manning the security checkpoint of the FBI's regional headquarters. His gray uniform hung loose on his thin frame, and his pale blue eyes held the cold satisfaction of someone who wielded what little power he had with ruthless precision. Frank straightened his shoulders as he surveyed his domain, the marble-floored lobby with its imposing seal embedded in the center, the metal detectors that hummed softly, and the steady stream of federal employees beginning their workday. This was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in bureaucratic procedure. "Morning, Frank," called Agent Tommy Morrison, a young white man in a navy suit who barely slowed his stride toward the elevators. "Morning, Agent Morrison," Frank replied with a respectful nod, his voice warm with deference. The pattern repeated throughout the early morning rush. White employees, briefcases in hand, badges flashed briefly, waves exchanged, passage granted without question. Frank's demeanor shifted like clockwork, professional courtesy for some, suspicious scrutiny for others. The criteria was never spoken but always applied. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife. "Kevin needs his child support. Don't make me call the court again." Frank's jaw tightened as he shoved the device back into his pocket. 15 years of marriage ended when she decided his paycheck wasn't enough. Now she lived in her new husband's suburban home while Frank rented a cramped apartment above a Korean barbecue restaurant, the smell of kimchi permanently embedded in his clothes. A group of Latino construction workers approached with visitor badges, and Frank's posture stiffened. "Hold up there," he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Empty your pockets. All of them." 15 floors above the city's morning rush, Danielle Harper stood before her hotel room mirror, methodically preparing for what would be the most challenging day of her career. At 34, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that could blend into any crowd. Smooth, dark skin that seemed to glow with inner strength, intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing, and natural hair styled in a sophisticated low bun that suggested both professionalism and quiet confidence. She selected her outfit with the precision of someone whose life often depended on such details. A tailored charcoal blazer that concealed the Kevlar vest beneath, matching slacks that allowed for movement, and low-heeled black pumps suitable for running if necessary. A simple gold chain around her neck held her real CIA identification, hidden beneath a white silk blouse. "Final briefing in 5 minutes," came the voice through her earpiece. "Control, her handler from Langley." "Copy," Danielle responded, her voice steady despite the weight of the mission ahead. For 3 months, they'd tracked a mole inside the FBI's Atlanta field office, someone selling classified information to foreign buyers. Today's operation would either expose the traitor or blow her cover entirely. Agent Rachel Stevens, the woman she was impersonating, was scheduled to return from assignment today, which meant Danielle had exactly 1 window to complete her infiltration. She touched the small of her back where her Glock 19 rested in its holster, then checked the false identification that marked her as Agent Stevens. Everything had to be perfect. One suspicious look, one wrong word, and 3 months of preparation would crumble. But as she gathered her purse and headed for the door, Danielle's thoughts drifted to her 8-year-old self, standing outside a similar federal building in Birmingham with her grandmother. They'd been there to report her father's suspicious death, only to be turned away by a security guard who'd looked at their skin color and decided their pain wasn't worth his time. "Today's different," she whispered to her reflection. "Today, I'm the one with the power." The irony wasn't lost on her. A black woman trained to be invisible, walking into a building where visibility might be her greatest threat. Danielle stepped through the revolving glass doors of the federal building, her heels clicking against the polished marble with measured confidence. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the lobby's imposing space. She could feel the weight of her mission pressing against her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Frank Coleman looked up from his security station, his pale eyes immediately locking onto her approaching figure. Something in his expression shifted, hardening like concrete setting in the sun. The casual professionalism he'd shown to the white employees moments earlier evaporated, replaced by a cold suspicion that radiated from every line of his weathered face. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby. "Stop right there." Danielle paused 3 feet from the metal detector, her training automatically cataloging exits, security cameras, and potential witnesses. A handful of federal employees moved through the adjacent checkpoint lanes, their conversations creating a low hum of background noise. None of them seemed to notice the brewing confrontation. "Good morning, officer," Danielle said, her voice calm and measured. She reached into her purse for her identification. "I'm Agent Rachel Stevens, reporting for duty." Frank's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a friendlier face. "Hold up there, sweetheart. Your kind don't belong here." The words hit Danielle like a physical blow, but her expression remained perfectly neutral. Years of covert training had taught her to absorb insults like armor-absorbing bullets. Still, she felt something cold and familiar twist in her stomach, the same feeling she'd carried since childhood when adults looked at her and saw only limitations. "I'm sorry," she replied, tilting her head slightly as if she hadn't heard correctly. Frank stepped out from behind his station, his security badge catching the morning light. He was taller than she'd initially estimated, probably 6 feet, but his thin frame and slouched posture robbed him of any real intimidation factor. What made him dangerous wasn't his size, but the uniform that gave weight to his prejudice. "You heard me," he said, moving closer until he stood directly in front of the metal detector, blocking her path. "This is a federal facility. We have procedures here. Security protocols." Danielle watched as Agent Morrison emerged from the elevator bank behind Frank, coffee in hand, heading for the exit. The young man's badge was barely visible, tucked carelessly into his jacket pocket, yet Frank offered him a respectful nod as he passed. "Of course," Danielle said, maintaining her professional tone. "I understand the need for security. That's why I'm prepared to follow all standard procedures." She extended her identification card, the one that had cost the CIA considerable resources to create. Every detail was perfect, from the holographic FBI seal to the magnetic strip encoding that would pass any scanner test. Frank snatched the card from her fingers with unnecessary force, his calloused thumb smudging the pristine plastic surface. He studied it for exactly 3 seconds before letting it drop to the marble floor with a sharp click that echoed through the lobby. "Oops," he said, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Pick it up." The command hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Danielle felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the careful control required to suppress 15 years of Delta Force combat training. Her body wanted to move, to respond to the threat with decisive action, but her mind held her still. She looked down at her identification card, lying face up on the cold marble. Agent Rachel Stevens' photograph stared back at her, a reminder of the role she was playing and the mission at stake. Slowly, deliberately, she bent to retrieve it, her movements controlled and graceful despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I don't care what fake identification you have," Frank continued as she straightened, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "This is a secure federal facility." He gestured toward a small plastic table beside the security checkpoint, the kind used for additional screening. The surface was scratched and stained from years of use, and Danielle noticed dried coffee rings marking its edges like brown halos. Empty your purse. Everything. I want to see every single item you're carrying. Danielle's eyes swept the lobby again, noting how the other employees continued their morning routines without interruption. A blonde woman in a red dress walked through the metal detector without even removing her jewelry. A middle-aged white man in a rumpled suit passed by with nothing more than a casual wave to Frank, his briefcase unopened and unexamined. Is this standard procedure for all federal employees? Danielle asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest she wasn't entirely submissive. Frank's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of coffee and cigarettes. It is for people who look like you. The words landed like a slap, but Danielle absorbed them with the same steady breathing she'd used during her first parachute jump over hostile territory. She thought of her grandmother's voice, strong and unwavering even in the face of discrimination. Baby girl, dignity is something they can't take from you unless you hand it over yourself. I see, Danielle said quietly. She moved to the plastic table and began methodically removing items from her purse, arranging them with deliberate care. Her wallet, containing credit cards in Rachel Stevens' name. A tube of lipstick in subtle berry shade. A small packet of tissues. Car keys for the rental sedan parked 2 blocks away. Each item was placed with precision, creating a neat grid on the scarred plastic surface. Frank watched her with the hungry satisfaction of a predator toying with prey. Take your time, he said, loud enough that several passing employees glanced in their direction before quickly looking away. We've got all day. Danielle's fingers brushed against the false bottom of her purse, where her real CIA credentials lay hidden alongside emergency cash and a backup communication device. For just a moment, she imagined the expression on Frank's face if she revealed her true identity. The shock, the fear, the immediate reversal of power dynamics. But revealing herself now would compromise 3 months of preparation and potentially endanger other operatives in the field. The mole they were hunting would disappear like smoke if word leaked that CIA was conducting an internal investigation. One word from me, Frank continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, and you could vanish without a trace. Disappear into the system where nobody would ever find you again. The threat hung between them like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the lobby's marble grandeur. Danielle felt something snap inside her chest, a wire that had been stretched too tight for too long. Her hands stilled on the table's surface, and when she looked up at Frank, he saw something in her dark eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. Vanish without a trace, she repeated softly, her voice carrying an undertone that Frank couldn't quite identify but that made the hair on his arms stand on end. That's an interesting choice of words, Officer Coleman. She had read his nameplate without seeming to look at it, and the use of his name sent a small chill down Frank's spine. There was something different about her now, something that didn't match the submissive victim he'd been expecting to create. Is there a problem here? The voice belonged to Agent Jennifer Walsh, a senior investigator with 20 years' experience and the authority to make Frank's life very difficult. She approached from the elevator bank, her gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Frank's demeanor shifted instantly, his aggressive posture melting into apologetic deference. No problem at all, Agent Walsh. Just conducting routine security screening. Agent Walsh's gaze moved from Frank to Danielle to the items scattered across the plastic table. Her expression gave nothing away, but Danielle could see the wheels turning behind her experienced eyes. Routine screening, Walsh repeated, her tone carefully neutral. I see. And this level of screening is applied to all incoming personnel. The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, and Frank found himself caught between his prejudice and his job security. He opened his mouth to respond, but Danielle spoke first. Agent Walsh, she said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. I'm Agent Rachel Stevens, reporting for my new assignment. Officer Coleman was just explaining your security procedures. The handshake was firm, confident, and entirely professional. Agent Walsh studied Danielle's face for a moment, recognition flickering in her eyes. Agent Stevens, Walsh said slowly. We've been expecting you. The tension in the lobby grew thick as honey, coating every surface with an uncomfortable awareness that something had shifted beyond the normal boundaries of routine security screening. Agent Walsh's presence created a triangle of power that left Frank Coleman sweating despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. "Officer Coleman," Agent Walsh said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 2 decades of federal service. "Perhaps you could finish Agent Stevens' screening so she can report to her assignment. I believe Director Harrison is expecting her this morning." Frank's pale eyes darted between the 2 women, his mind racing to find solid ground in what suddenly felt like quicksand. The mention of Director Harrison, the most senior official in the Atlanta field office, sent a cold spike of anxiety through his chest. His fingers trembled slightly as he gestured toward Danielle's belongings still scattered across the plastic table. "Of course, Agent Walsh," he said, his voice strained with forced professionalism. "Just need to complete the standard procedures." But even as he spoke, Frank's resentment burned hotter than ever. Here was this woman, this outsider who didn't belong in his world, being defended by the very people who should understand the importance of maintaining proper security. The unfairness of it gnawed at him like acid, eating away at his already fragile sense of control. Danielle carefully returned her belongings to her purse, each movement deliberate and unhurried. She could feel Frank's hostility radiating toward her like heat from a furnace, and her training told her that cornered predators were often the most dangerous. The smart play would be to accept Agent Walsh's intervention and walk away, but something deeper than strategy was at work now. "Thank you, Agent Walsh," Danielle said, shouldering her purse. "I appreciate your assistance." Agent Walsh nodded and turned toward the elevators, clearly expecting Danielle to follow. But as they moved away from the security checkpoint, Frank's voice cut through the lobby's ambient noise like a rusty blade. "This isn't over," he called out, his words barely above a whisper but carrying enough venom to stop both women in their tracks. "People like you always think you can just waltz in here and take what doesn't belong to you." Danielle turned slowly, her brown eyes meeting Frank's pale ones across the marble expanse. For a moment, the lobby seemed to hold its breath, other employees pausing in their morning routines to watch the drama unfold. "People like me," Danielle repeated, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Agent Walsh look at her with new interest. "What exactly do you mean by that, Officer Coleman?" Frank's jaw worked silently for several seconds, caught between his desire to voice his prejudice and his fear of the consequences. The federal workplace had policies about such things, policies that could end his career if he pushed too far. But 15 years of bitterness and frustration had built up like water behind a dam, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, stepping out from behind his security station. "Coming in here with your fancy clothes and your attitude, thinking you can just demand respect you haven't earned." Agent Walsh moved closer to Danielle, her protective instincts kicking in despite not fully understanding the situation. She had seen enough workplace harassment in her career to recognize the warning signs, and Frank's behavior was raising every red flag in her mental catalog. "Officer Coleman," Walsh said sharply, "I think you need to return to your duties." But Frank was beyond hearing reason now. The morning's accumulated humiliations had become a poison in his bloodstream, and Danielle had become the focal point for every disappointment in his life. His ex-wife's demands for money, his cramped apartment, his dead-end job, the way younger agents looked through him like he was invisible furniture. "No," he said, his voice growing louder. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. 15 years of keeping this building safe, and now they want me to just wave through anyone who shows up with a piece of plastic and a story." Several other employees had stopped their conversations now, forming a loose semicircle around the confrontation. Danielle noticed Agent Morrison among them, the young man who had passed through security without question earlier. His face showed confusion and growing discomfort as he began to understand what was happening. "Frank," Agent Morrison said hesitantly, "maybe we should all just calm down." "Don't you Frank me," Coleman snapped, whirling on the younger man. "You people don't understand what it's like. Nobody respects the badge anymore. Nobody respects the uniform." Danielle watched Frank's breakdown with a detached assessment of someone trained to read human psychology under stress. He was spiraling, his carefully maintained facade of authority crumbling under the weight of his own insecurities. The dangerous part was that desperate people often made desperate choices. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a duel. Danielle felt something cold and familiar settle in her stomach, the same feeling she'd experienced in hostile territory when rules of engagement became fluid and survival depended on split-second decisions. "And where exactly do I belong?" she asked, taking a step toward Frank despite Agent Walsh's warning hand on her arm. Frank's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction as he sensed what he perceived as an opening. "Somewhere more appropriate for your kind. Maybe behind a desk in some social services office, or cleaning offices after hours when decent people have gone home." The collective intake of breath from the watching employees was audible. Agent Morrison's face went pale, and even Agent Walsh seemed stunned by the naked racism of Frank's words. But Danielle didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow curve of her lips that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any angry response could have been. "After hours," she repeated thoughtfully. "When decent people have gone home. That's when you think I do my best work." Something in her tone made Frank's confidence waver. There was an undercurrent to her words that he couldn't identify, something that suggested knowledge and experience far beyond what her appearance suggested. "That's right," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. Danielle nodded slowly, as if considering his assessment. "You might be surprised, Officer Coleman, at how much work gets done after hours. How many problems get solved when decent people aren't watching." Agent Walsh stepped between them, her professional instincts finally overriding her shock at the situation's rapid deterioration. "Agent Stevens, perhaps we should go to my office. Officer Coleman, you need to return to your post immediately." But Frank wasn't ready to let go of his moment of perceived power. The adrenaline of confrontation had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for too long, and the thought of backing down now felt like another defeat in a life full of them. "This conversation isn't finished," he said, pointing a shaking finger at Danielle. "I know your type. I've seen what happens when people like you get ideas above your station. But this is my building, my checkpoint, and I won't be disrespected by some affirmative action hire who thinks a fake badge gives her the right to look down on honest working people." The lobby had gone completely silent now, the morning's routine business suspended as everyone processed the ugly scene unfolding before them. Danielle could see the security cameras recording everything, could imagine the reports that would be filed, the investigations that would follow. Part of her wanted to end this now, to reveal just enough of her true identity to put Frank in his place without compromising her mission. But another part, the part that remembered being 8 years old and helpless, wanted to see how far he would push before consequences caught up with him. "Officer Coleman," she said quietly, "I think you should be very careful about your next words." Frank heard the warning but interpreted it as weakness. In his mind, she was still just another woman who didn't belong in his world, and warnings from such people carried no weight. "Or what?" he said, stepping closer until he was well within her personal space. "What exactly are you going to do about it?" The sharp wail of the building's fire alarm cut through the tension like a knife through silk, its piercing sound reverberating off the marble walls and drowning out Frank's last threatening words. Red emergency lights began flashing in rhythmic patterns, casting eerie shadows across the suddenly chaotic lobby. "Building evacuation," came the authoritative voice over the intercom system. "All personnel must exit immediately via the nearest stairwell. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Agent Walsh's training kicked in immediately. "Everyone out," she commanded, her voice carrying over the alarm's shriek. "Standard evacuation procedures. Move quickly but don't run." The lobby erupted into controlled chaos as federal employees began streaming toward the emergency exits. Agent Morrison grabbed his coffee and headed for the stairs, along with the other morning arrivals who had been witnesses to the confrontation. But as Danielle moved to follow the crowd, Frank's hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. "Not so fast," he said, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "Security personnel have special protocols during emergencies. You're staying with me until I can verify your credentials properly." Agent Walsh turned back, her face showing alarm at Frank's violation of basic evacuation procedures. "Officer Coleman, everyone leaves during a fire alarm. No exceptions." "Ma'am, with respect," Frank said, his voice taking on an official tone that masked his personal vendetta. "I have reason to believe this individual may pose a security risk." I can't allow potential threats to evacuate with genuine personnel. Danielle felt the familiar weight of her concealed weapon pressing against her back, and for a moment her training screamed at her to disable Frank and extract herself from the situation. But Agent Walsh was watching, and any violent action now would destroy her cover completely. Officer Coleman, Walsh said, her voice sharp with authority, release Agent Stevens immediately and follow evacuation procedures. But Frank had found his justification now, the official cover he needed for his personal hatred. I'm sorry, Agent Walsh, but security protocols are clear. Suspicious individuals must be secured during emergency situations. The alarm continued its relentless wailing, and the lobby was emptying rapidly. In less than 2 minutes, only the three of them remained in the vast marble space, red emergency lights painting everything in hellish tones. Agent Walsh faced an impossible choice. She could override Frank's decision, but doing so during an emergency evacuation would create a paper trail and official inquiries. If Frank was genuinely concerned about security, her interference could be seen as compromising building safety. 5 minutes, she said finally, her eyes apologetic as they met Danielle's. I'll coordinate with fire department outside and return for you both. Officer Coleman, if anything happens to Agent Stevens, you'll answer to me personally. With that, she turned and hurried toward the emergency exit, leaving Danielle and Frank alone in the echoing lobby. The silence that followed Walsh's departure was more oppressive than the alarm had been. Frank released Danielle's arm but positioned himself between her and the exits, his thin frame somehow seeming larger in the empty space. Now we can have a real conversation, he said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Danielle's skin crawl. No witnesses, no interruptions. Just you and me. Danielle remained perfectly still, her hands at her sides, every muscle coiled with controlled tension. She was trapped now, not by Frank's physical presence but by the circumstances that demanded she maintain her cover. One wrong move, one display of her true capabilities, and 3 months of careful preparation would be wasted. What do you want, Officer Coleman? She asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Frank began to pace in front of the security checkpoint, his movements restless and predatory. What I want is respect. What I want is for people like you to understand that there are rules in this world, hierarchies that matter. He stopped pacing and fixed her with his pale stare. You see, I've been watching people like you my whole life. Coming into places where you don't belong, taking jobs from qualified candidates, demanding special treatment because of your color. Danielle listened to his words with the detached analysis of someone trained to extract intelligence from hostile subjects. Frank wasn't just racist. He was desperate, clinging to his prejudice as the only thing that made sense of his failures. And what hierarchy do you think I'm violating? She asked. Don't play dumb with me, Frank snapped. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This is a federal facility, one of the most important buildings in the Southeast. The people who work here are the best and brightest, the cream of American law enforcement. He gestured around the empty lobby as if it were a cathedral. My father worked security for the government for 30 years. My grandfather before him. This family has been protecting American interests since before you people even had the right to vote. Danielle felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same rage that had driven her to excel in every training program, to push herself beyond every limit. But she channeled that anger into focus, using it to sharpen her awareness of Frank's psychological state. And you feel that legacy is threatened, she said, not asking but stating. Frank's face flushed red. Threatened? It's already destroyed. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch everything your family built get handed over to people who didn't earn it? Tell me, Danielle said simply. The invitation to explain himself seemed to catch Frank off guard. He had expected resistance, argument, perhaps tears. He hadn't expected genuine interest in his perspective. My ex-wife left me for a lawyer, he said, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Said I wasn't ambitious enough, didn't make enough money. But I'm doing honest work, protecting people, serving my country. Meanwhile, people like you get promoted ahead of me because of quotas and politics. Danielle nodded slowly, filing away each piece of information. Frank's resentment wasn't just racial. It was personal, tied to his sense of masculine failure and economic displacement. "You think I took something that should have been yours," she said. "I know you did," Frank replied hotly. "Every promotion that goes to someone like you is a promotion stolen from someone who earned it. Every job, every opportunity." The building's emergency lighting cast shifting shadows across Frank's face, making his features appear almost demonic in the red glow. Danielle realized that they were completely alone now, cut off from witnesses and accountability. Frank had all the justification he needed to claim she had been a security threat, to explain away whatever happened next. "So what's your solution?" she asked. Frank's smile was ugly and cold. "My solution is to make sure you understand your place. To teach you that actions have consequences, that you can't just walk into my world and expect to be welcomed." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the yellow stains on his teeth. "You see, in emergency situations, sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes suspicious individuals resist security measures and force us to use appropriate responses." Danielle felt the familiar calm that came over her in combat situations, the slowing of time that allowed her to process multiple variables simultaneously. Frank was building up to violence, working himself into the mental state where he could justify physical assault as professional duty. "Appropriate responses," she repeated. "That's right," Frank said, his hand moving to the expandable baton on his duty belt. "Sometimes people don't cooperate with security screening. Sometimes they pose threats that require subduing." The fire alarm continued its mechanical shrieking, providing perfect acoustic cover for whatever Frank was planning. Danielle calculated distances, angles, response times. The nearest security camera was behind Frank's position, which meant her back would be to it when he made his move. "Officer Coleman," she said, her voice taking on a different quality now, something harder and more dangerous. "I think you should reconsider your current course of action." But Frank heard only defiance in her words, and defiance was something he could no longer tolerate. His hand closed around the baton's grip, and Danielle saw the exact moment when his internal struggle ended and violence became inevitable. "Last chance," he said, pulling the weapon from his belt. "Get on your knees and apologize for disrespecting this uniform. Maybe then I'll let you walk out of here with just a warning." Danielle looked at Frank Coleman, this broken man who had chosen hatred over healing, and felt something shift inside her chest. The time for pretending was almost over. "Officer Coleman," she said quietly, "you have no idea who you're threatening." Frank's expandable baton gleamed under the emergency lighting as he extended it with a sharp metallic click that echoed through the empty lobby. The sound seemed to awaken something primal in his pale eyes, a hunger that had been building for 15 years of perceived slights and professional disappointments. "On your knees," he repeated, his voice thick with the authority he believed his uniform granted him. "Now!" Danielle remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. In her peripheral vision, she caught sight of something that made her heart skip. A small framed photograph that had fallen from Frank's security station during the evacuation chaos. The image showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with Frank's pale eyes but a warmer smile. "You have a daughter," she said quietly, her words cutting through Frank's aggressive posturing like a blade through fog. Frank's grip on the baton tightened, but confusion flickered across his features. "What did you say?" "The photograph," Danielle nodded toward the fallen frame. "She has your eyes. Beautiful little girl." For a moment, Frank's mask of hatred slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. "Don't you dare talk about my daughter. You don't get to mention her." But Danielle had found her opening, the crack in Frank's armor that might save them both from the violence that seemed inevitable just seconds before. "What's her name?" "Rebecca," Frank said before he could stop himself, then his face hardened again. "But that's none of your business." "Rebecca," Danielle repeated softly. "Pretty name. How often do you see her?" Frank's jaw worked silently, and Danielle could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Part of him wanted to strike out, to release 15 years of frustration on the woman standing before him. But another part, the part that still loved his daughter, was listening despite itself. "Every other weekend," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the continuing fire alarm. "When her mother lets me." Danielle took a careful step closer, her movements slow and non-threatening. That must be hard. Being away from her so much. You don't know anything about it, Frank snapped, but the fire had gone out of his voice. You don't know what it's like to have your whole life torn apart, to lose everything that matters. Actually, Danielle said, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket, I know exactly what that feels like. Frank tensed, raising the baton defensively, but Danielle's hand emerged holding a small leather wallet. She opened it carefully, revealing a worn photograph of her own. The image showed a distinguished black man in a military uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals, standing beside a young woman who looked remarkably like Danielle. This is my father, she said, holding the photograph where Frank could see it. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Harper, United States Army. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work as a military liaison with federal law enforcement. Frank's eyes moved between the photograph and Danielle's face, seeing the resemblance and the obvious pride in her voice. Why are you showing me this? Because 15 years ago, my father walked into a federal building in Birmingham, Alabama, trying to report suspicious activity he'd observed during his deployment. Intelligence that could have saved American lives. Danielle's voice remained steady, but Frank could hear the emotion beneath the surface, a pain that matched his own in its depth. The security officer at that building took one look at my father's skin color and decided he was lying. Decided that a decorated war veteran was some kind of threat. Frank's grip on the baton loosened slightly. What happened? My father was escorted out of the building and told never to return. 3 weeks later, the intelligence he'd tried to report proved accurate. A convoy was ambushed using the exact tactics he'd warned about. 7 soldiers died, including 2 men from his old unit. The fire alarm seemed to fade into background noise as Frank processed what Danielle was telling him. Your father blamed himself for those deaths, Danielle continued. Believed that if he'd been white, if he'd looked different, those soldiers would still be alive. The guilt ate at him for months until one night, driving home from another failed attempt to get someone to listen, he wrapped his car around a tree on Highway 280. Frank's baton clattered to the marble floor as his hand went limp. Jesus! The official report called it an accident, Danielle said, returning the photograph to her wallet. But I was 12 years old, and I knew better. I knew my father didn't die in a car crash. He died from racism. He died because someone who looked like you decided that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly have anything important to say. The lobby fell silent except for the mechanical wailing of the alarm system. Frank stared at the woman before him, seeing her not as a threat to his worldview but as someone who had lost just as much as he had, perhaps more. I'm sorry, he said, the words barely audible. I'm sorry about your father. Danielle nodded, accepting his condolence with grace. That's why I do what I do, Officer Coleman. That's why I wear this badge and work in buildings like this. Because I swore that what happened to my father would never happen to anyone else's father. Frank bent slowly to retrieve his fallen baton, but instead of extending it again, he collapsed it and returned it to his belt. I didn't know, he said weakly. How could you? Danielle replied. You looked at me and saw what you expected to see. Just like that security officer looked at my father and saw what he expected to see. The truth of her words hit Frank like a physical blow. He thought about Rebecca, about the bedtime stories he read to her every other weekend, about the values he claimed to be teaching her. What would she think if she could see him now, threatening an innocent woman because of the color of her skin? I'm not a bad person, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I know you're not, Danielle said, and surprisingly, she meant it. Bad people don't keep pictures of their daughters on their desks. Bad people don't spend 15 years in public service, even when it doesn't pay well. Frank looked up at her, confusion and shame warring in his pale eyes. Then why do I feel like this? Why do I hate so much? Because hurt people, Danielle said simply. And you've been hurting for a long time. The fire alarm stopped abruptly, leaving them in a silence that felt profound after the mechanical shrieking. In the distance, they could hear voices as people began returning to the building, the emergency apparently resolved. Your ex-wife, Danielle said gently. She left because of the money? Frank nodded miserably. Said she married a security guard, not a career security guard. Said she deserved better than I could give her. And that pain, that rejection, it had to go somewhere. So I put it on you, Frank said, understanding dawning in his voice. On people who look like you. Because it was easier than admitting I wasn't enough. It's human nature, Danielle said. When we're hurting, we look for someone to blame. Someone who's different enough that we can pretend their success is our failure. Agent Walsh's voice echoed from the stairwell as she called out, "All clear!" False alarm from the kitchen ventilation system. Frank looked at Danielle with something approaching panic. What happens now? What do I do? You choose, Danielle said simply. You can keep being the man who threatened me in this lobby, or you can be the man who wants his daughter to be proud of him. The sound of footsteps grew closer as federal employees began streaming back into the building. Frank had perhaps 30 seconds before Agent Walsh returned, 30 seconds to decide who he wanted to be. Agent Stevens, he said formally, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before. I apologize for the delay in your security screening. You're cleared for entry. Danielle nodded, shouldering her purse. Thank you, Officer Coleman. As Agent Walsh emerged from the stairwell, followed by other returning employees, she found Frank and Danielle standing at a respectful distance from each other, their earlier confrontation apparently resolved. Everything all right here? Walsh asked, her sharp eyes moving between them. Everything's fine, Danielle replied. Officer Coleman was just explaining some of the building's security features. Frank nodded, his face carefully neutral. Agent Stevens has been cleared for entry, ma'am. But as the lobby filled with people and normal business resumed, both Frank and Danielle knew that something fundamental had changed between them. The question was whether that change would be enough to bridge the gap that hatred had carved. The morning had passed in a blur of briefings and introductory meetings as Danielle settled into her role as Agent Rachel Stevens. She had successfully infiltrated the counterintelligence division, gaining access to the files and personnel she needed to identify the mole. But her mind kept drifting back to Frank Coleman and the broken man she had encountered at the security checkpoint. During her lunch break, she found herself in the building's cafeteria, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture that somehow managed to feel both crowded and lonely. She selected a simple sandwich and found a table near the windows overlooking Peachtree Street, where autumn leaves danced in the October breeze. Mind if I sit here? Danielle looked up to see Frank standing beside her table, holding a brown bag lunch and looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. Gone was the aggressive posture and cold stare from the morning. In their place was something that looked almost like humility. Of course, she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Frank sat down carefully, as if afraid sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile understanding they had reached. He unwrapped a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that looked homemade, the kind of lunch a man makes for himself when he's counting every dollar. I wanted to apologize, he said without preamble. Properly apologize. Not just the official version I gave you downstairs. Danielle studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Go ahead. What I did this morning was wrong. Not just unprofessional, but morally wrong. Frank's voice was quiet, barely audible over the cafeteria's ambient noise. I let my personal problems turn me into someone I don't want to be. Someone your daughter wouldn't recognize, Danielle said gently. Frank winced as if struck. Rebecca thinks I'm a hero. She tells her friends that her daddy protects important people and keeps the country safe. His laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. If she could have seen me this morning. But she didn't, Danielle pointed out. And more importantly, that doesn't have to be who you are. Frank looked up at her, confusion evident in his pale eyes. Why are you being kind to me? After what I did, what I said, you should be filing complaints and demanding my termination. Danielle took a sip of her coffee, considering her words carefully. The truth was complicated. Part of her response came from her training, the ability to read people and find ways to turn enemies into assets. But another part, perhaps the larger part, came from genuine compassion for a man who reminded her painfully of what her father might have become if bitterness had taken root in his heart. "Because I've seen what hatred does to people," she said finally. "It doesn't just hurt the targets. It destroys the people who carry it." Frank nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had long suspected about himself. "I wasn't always like this. When I was younger, when I first started this job, I believed in things. Justice, fairness, protecting people." "What changed?" "Life," Frank said simply. "Disappointment. Watching other people get ahead while I stayed in the same position year after year. My marriage falling apart because I couldn't provide the lifestyle my wife wanted." He paused to take a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as if the food had no taste. "It was easier to blame external factors than to look at my own failures. Easier to think the system was rigged against me than to admit I might not be as special as I thought." Danielle found herself genuinely moved by his honesty. In her years of covert work, she had interrogated terrorists and enemy agents, but there was something more vulnerable about Frank's confession than anything she had heard in a black site interrogation room. "Tell me about Rebecca," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. Frank's entire demeanor shifted, his face lighting up with genuine warmth for the first time since she had met him. "She's 8 years old and absolutely fearless. Last weekend, she climbed to the top of the jungle gym at the park even though she's afraid of heights, just because some older kid said girls couldn't do it." "Sounds like she gets her determination from you." "From her mother, more likely," Frank said with a rueful smile. "Jennifer was always the strong one in our marriage. She's the one who pushed me to apply for this job in the first place, said I had potential I wasn't using." "But you stayed in security work after the divorce." Frank nodded. "It was the only place I felt like I had any authority, any control. Home was gone, the marriage was over, but here I could still be somebody. I could still matter." Danielle understood the psychology behind his words better than he knew. She had seen the same pattern in countless subjects. People who compensated for powerlessness in their personal lives by asserting dominance wherever they could find it. "What does Rebecca want to be when she grows up?" she asked. "A doctor," Frank said, his pride evident. "She's already reading books about the human body that are way above her grade level. Last month, she diagnosed our neighbor's cat with an ear infection just by observing its behavior." "That's remarkable." "She's remarkable," Frank agreed. "And she's everything good about me and her mother combined. I look at her sometimes and wonder how I helped create something so perfect." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of the morning's confrontation gradually lifting between them. Other FBI employees moved through the cafeteria around them, but Danielle noticed that several people nodded respectfully to Frank as they passed. Whatever his personal struggles, he was clearly well regarded by many of his colleagues. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said suddenly. "Of course. This morning, when I was threatening you, you never looked scared. Not once. Most people would have been terrified, but you just seemed calm. Like you were in complete control of the situation." Danielle felt a flutter of concern. Frank was more observant than she had given him credit for, and his question touched dangerously close to her true identity. "I've dealt with bullies before," she said carefully. "It was more than that," Frank pressed. "When you told me I should be careful about my next words, there was something in your voice. Something that made me believe you could back up that warning." For a moment, Danielle considered deflecting or changing the subject. But Frank's honesty deserved an honest response, even if she couldn't tell him the complete truth. "My father trained me," she said finally. "After what happened to him, he made sure I would never be helpless in the face of someone else's hatred. Self-defense classes, conflict de-escalation, situational awareness. He wanted me to be prepared for a world that might not always welcome me." Frank absorbed this information with a solemn nod. "He sounds like a good father." He was. Even at the end, when the guilt was eating him alive, he never stopped trying to protect me and prepare me for the future. "I hope I'm doing the same for Rebecca," Frank said quietly. "Though after this morning, I'm not sure I'm setting the right example." "You recognized your mistake," Danielle pointed out. "You apologized and you're trying to do better." That's exactly the kind of example she needs. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message, and his face softened as he read it. "Speaking of Rebecca," he said, turning the phone so Danielle could see the screen. The message was from his ex-wife Jennifer, but the photo was clearly taken by Rebecca herself. It showed a crayon drawing of a tall figure in a uniform standing next to a smaller figure with pigtails. Above them, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "My hero daddy." "She drew this during art class today," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Jennifer says she's been working on it all week." Danielle felt her own throat tighten as she looked at the innocent drawing. "She loves you very much." "I don't deserve it," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after the man I've become." "Then become the man she thinks you are," Danielle said firmly. "It's not too late, Frank. It's never too late to choose to be better." Frank looked at her across the small cafeteria table, and Danielle saw something she hadn't expected to see: hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe his story didn't have to end with bitterness and regret. "Would you?" He started, then stopped, seeming to gather courage. "Would you like to see more pictures of her? I know it's probably boring for someone who doesn't have kids, but—" "I'd love to," Danielle said, and meant it. For the next 20 minutes, Frank showed her photos and videos of Rebecca on his phone. His daughter at a school play, dressed as a sunflower and beaming with pride. Rebecca building a sandcastle during their last beach weekend together. A video of her reading a book aloud to their elderly neighbor, her young voice serious and careful with each word. As Danielle watched Frank's face transform with paternal love, she realized that beneath all the bitterness and prejudice was a man capable of profound tenderness. The question was whether that tenderness could expand beyond his daughter to include the rest of the world. The afternoon had passed peacefully after Danielle and Frank's lunch conversation. She had spent the time reviewing classified files in the counterintelligence division, carefully building her case against the suspected mole while maintaining her cover as Agent Rachel Stevens. But as the workday wound down, everything was about to unravel in the most devastating way possible. Danielle was walking past the security checkpoint when she heard Frank's voice, warm and animated, speaking into his phone. "I know, sweetheart. Daddy misses you too. What did you learn in school today?" She slowed her pace, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a call with Rebecca. Frank's entire posture had softened, his usually rigid stance melting into something gentle and paternal. "A book report on heroes?" Frank continued, his voice filled with pride. "That sounds wonderful, honey. Who did you choose to write about?" Danielle found herself smiling as she listened to Frank's side of the conversation. The transformation from the bitter man she had encountered that morning to this loving father was remarkable. "Your teacher said what?" Frank's tone shifted slightly, becoming more attentive. "She wants you to interview a real hero for extra credit?" There was a pause as Rebecca spoke on the other end, and Danielle could see Frank's face lighting up with an idea. "Well, sweetheart, Daddy met someone today who might be perfect for your project. A real FBI agent who—" Frank's words died in his throat as his eyes met Danielle's across the lobby. For a moment, they shared a warm smile, the kind that passed between people who had found unexpected understanding. But that moment shattered like glass when Agent Walsh's voice cut through the lobby from behind them. "Agent Stevens," Walsh called out, approaching with another woman Danielle didn't recognize. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet someone." The woman beside Walsh was tall and blonde, with a kind of professional bearing that spoke of years in federal service. She wore a navy blue suit and carried herself with quiet confidence, but there was something in her blue eyes that made Danielle's blood run cold. "Agent Stevens," Walsh continued. "This is the real Agent Rachel Stevens. She just returned from her assignment in Phoenix." The lobby seemed to freeze around them. Frank's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble floor as he stared at the two women. The real Rachel Stevens looked from Walsh to Danielle with growing confusion and alarm. "I'm sorry," the real Rachel said slowly, "but who exactly is this woman?" Agent Walsh's face went pale as the implications hit her. Her hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon as she turned to face Danielle. "Ma'am, I need you to identify yourself immediately." Danielle's mind raced through her options. Her cover was blown completely, but she was surrounded by federal agents in the middle of an FBI field office. Drawing her weapon would be suicide, and running would only confirm her guilt. She could feel the weight of her CIA credentials in her jacket pocket, but revealing them would compromise her entire mission. "Rebecca!" Frank called out, realizing his daughter was still on the line. "Honey, Daddy has to call you back, okay? I love you." He ended the call and stared at Danielle with a mixture of confusion and growing betrayal. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, other FBI employees had begun to notice the commotion. Agent Morrison appeared from the elevator bank, his young face showing alarm as he took in the tense scene. "Step away from her, Frank," Agent Walsh commanded, her weapon now drawn but held low. "Everyone else, clear the area." But Frank didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer to Danielle, his pale eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "This morning, in the lobby, you were lying to me. Everything you said, everything about your father." "Frank," Danielle began, but he cut her off with a gesture that was both angry and heartbroken. "Was any of it real?" he demanded. "Your father, the story about Birmingham, any of it?" Danielle met his gaze steadily, knowing that her next words would either save what they had built or destroy it completely. "My father's story was real. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Harper died because of racism, just like I told you." "But you're not Agent Rachel Stevens," Frank said, his voice growing louder and more accusatory. "You're some kind of spy, some kind of terrorist." "I'm not a terrorist," Danielle said firmly, but she could see that Frank wasn't listening anymore. The betrayal was written across his face in stark, painful lines. The man who had shown her pictures of his daughter, who had opened his heart about his failures and fears, now looked at her as if she were the embodiment of every deception that had ever wounded him. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, backing away from her. "I told you about Rebecca. I showed you her pictures. I trusted you." Agent Walsh stepped between them, her weapon now raised and aimed at Danielle's center mass. "Ma'am, you need to get on the ground immediately. Hands behind your head." But Frank was beyond hearing Walsh's commands. The emotional breakthrough they had shared over lunch had become a weapon turned against him, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "My daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "You asked about my daughter. You made me tell you about her. What kind of sick game is this?" "Frank, please listen," Danielle tried again, but he was spiraling into panic now. "No," he shouted, loud enough that his voice echoed through the lobby. "You came here under false pretenses. You infiltrated a federal facility. You manipulated me, made me care about you, made me think." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Danielle could see the rest of it in his eyes. "Made me think I could be better. Made me think someone could see past my mistakes and find something worth saving." Agent Morrison had drawn his weapon as well now, and Danielle found herself at the center of a tactical formation. More agents were arriving from the upper floors, alerted by the commotion. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "I'm reaching for my identification," Danielle announced clearly, moving her hand slowly toward her jacket pocket. "I'm a federal agent." "Bullshit," Frank spat. "Federal agents don't lie about who they are. Federal agents don't manipulate people and play with their emotions." Walsh's eyes never left Danielle as she spoke. "Very slowly. Any sudden movements and we will fire." Danielle's fingers found the leather folder containing her real CIA credentials. She could end this now, could prove her legitimacy and salvage her mission. But as she looked at Frank's shattered expression, she realized that some damage couldn't be undone. "I was undercover," she said quietly, still addressing Frank rather than the agents surrounding her. "I'm CIA. I was investigating a security breach in this building." "CIA," Frank repeated, and somehow the word sounded even worse coming from his lips than terrorist had. "You're CIA, and you used me. You used my feelings, my guilt about this morning, to get information." "That's not what happened," Danielle protested, but even as she said it, she could see how it looked from Frank's perspective. A CIA operative had infiltrated his building, gained his trust through emotional manipulation, and pumped him for information about his personal life. The fact that her compassion had been genuine, that their connection had been real, would never matter now. "Frank," she said, pulling out her credentials and holding them where everyone could see. "I never lied to you about anything that mattered. My father's story, everything I told you about why I do this work, it was all true." But Frank was already turning away, his face closing off like shutters slamming shut. "Agent Walsh, I want this woman arrested. I want her charged with impersonation of a federal officer, infiltration of a secure facility, and whatever else you can think of." "Frank, please," Danielle called after him as Walsh examined her CIA identification. He turned back one last time, and the look he gave her was worse than hatred. It was disappointment so profound it seemed to physically pain him. "I actually believed you cared," he said softly. "I thought maybe, for the first time in years, someone saw something in me worth saving. But you were just doing your job, weren't you? Just another mark to manipulate." "No," Danielle said desperately. "Frank, that's not." But he was already walking away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As Agent Walsh confirmed Danielle's credentials and began the process of sorting out the jurisdictional nightmare she had created, Frank Coleman disappeared into the elevator bank and out of her life. The mission was blown. Her cover was destroyed. And somewhere in the wreckage of professional duty and personal connection, Danielle realized she had lost something she hadn't even known she valued: the trust of a broken man who had briefly believed he could be better. Frank Coleman sat on the edge of his unmade bed, staring at his phone screen for the third time in the past hour. Rebecca's drawing still glowed from the display, her crayon portrait of "my hero daddy," now feeling like a mockery of everything he had become. The smell of kimchi and grilled meat drifted up through the thin floorboards, mixing with the stale air of his cramped studio apartment. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Danielle's face in that moment when Agent Walsh had exposed her lie. The shock, the regret, the desperate attempt to explain. But what haunted him most wasn't her deception. It was the memory of how safe he had felt during their lunch conversation, how for one brief hour he had believed someone could see past his failures and find something worth redemption. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Rebecca keeps asking when she can call Daddy about her hero project. She's so excited about interviewing your FBI friend." Frank's chest tightened as he read the message. How could he explain to his 8-year-old daughter that her daddy had been fooled by a spy? That the woman he had wanted Rebecca to meet was just another person who had lied to him? A sharp knock at his door interrupted his spiral of self-pity. Frank glanced at the clock, wondering who would visit at this ungodly hour. When he opened the door, he found Agent Walsh standing in the narrow hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking like she hadn't slept either. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Frank stepped aside, suddenly aware of how pathetic his living situation must appear to someone of Walsh's stature. The studio apartment contained a Murphy bed that he hadn't bothered to fold up, a small kitchenette with dishes piling in the sink, and a single window that looked out onto the restaurant's dumpster. "Coffee," Walsh offered, extending one of the cups. "Thanks," Frank muttered, accepting the drink and gesturing to his only chair. "You can sit if you want. Sorry about the mess." Walsh remained standing, her sharp eyes taking in the sparse furnishings and the framed photo of Rebecca that sat on Frank's nightstand. "Cute kid," she said. "What do you want, Agent Walsh?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "To talk about yesterday. About Agent Harper." Frank's jaw tightened at the mention of Danielle's real name. "Nothing to talk about. She lied, she manipulated me, and now she's gone. Case closed." "Is it?" Walsh asked, settling into the chair despite his protests. "Because I spent most of last night reading her file, and I think you might want to hear what I learned." "I don't care about her file. Her father really was Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Harper," Walsh continued as if Frank hadn't spoken. "Decorated war hero. Exactly like she told you. And he really did die in that car accident on Highway 280 in Birmingham, 15 years ago." Frank's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. So the security guard who turned him away from the federal building that day? His name was Ronald Peterson. He was fired 6 months later for a pattern of discriminatory behavior, but not before Lieutenant Colonel Harper's intelligence proved accurate. 7 soldiers died in that ambush, just like she said. Walsh pulled out a tablet and swiped to show Frank a newspaper clipping from 2008. The headline read, "Local War Hero Dies in Highway Accident." Below it was a photo of Lieutenant Colonel Harper in his dress uniform, standing beside a young woman who looked exactly like Danielle. "She wasn't lying about her father," Walsh said quietly. "And she wasn't lying about why she does this work." Frank stared at the photograph, feeling something crack open in his chest. But she was still lying about who she was. She was still manipulating me. Was she? Walsh asked. Or was she doing her job while also trying to reach out to someone she recognized was in pain? Frank set his coffee cup down on the small table beside his bed and rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands. "What do you want from me, Agent Walsh?" "I want you to understand something about undercover work," she said. "Agents like Harper spend months, sometimes years, pretending to be someone else. They live in constant danger, surrounded by people who would kill them if their true identity was discovered. The psychological toll is enormous." She paused, studying Frank's face carefully. "But yesterday, when I watched her talking to you after the fire alarm, I saw something I've never seen in 15 years of working with undercover operatives." "Which was?" "She forgot she was undercover," Walsh said simply. "For those few minutes in the lobby, and later in the cafeteria, she wasn't Agent Rachel Stevens on a mission. She was just Danielle Harper, talking to someone she genuinely cared about." Frank's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee again. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've read her psychological evaluations. Harper has trust issues that go back to her father's death. She doesn't open up to people easily, and she never discusses her personal history unless absolutely necessary for operational security." Walsh leaned forward in her chair, her voice growing more intense. "But she told you about her father without being asked. She showed you his photograph. She shared details about her childhood trauma that weren't in any mission briefing." "Maybe it was just good tradecraft," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Frank," Walsh said gently, "I've been doing this work for 20 years. I know the difference between manipulation and genuine human connection. What I saw between you two was real." Frank stood abruptly and walked to his small window, staring out at the dumpster below. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. She still lied about who she was." "She was protecting a classified operation," Walsh replied. "An operation that, by the way, was successful. We identified the mole yesterday evening and made an arrest. Harper's work may have prevented classified intelligence from reaching foreign adversaries." Frank turned back to face her, confusion evident in his tired eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that woman is sitting in a hotel room right now, blaming herself for hurting you. Because despite completing a successful mission, she's more concerned about the fact that she lost your trust than she is about the commendation she's going to receive." Walsh stood and moved toward the door, but paused before leaving. "And because I think you care about her too, more than you want to admit." After Walsh left, Frank found himself alone with thoughts that felt too large for his cramped apartment. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the photos of Rebecca again, stopping at the drawing of "My Hero Daddy." His daughter believed in heroes, believed that her father was one of them. What would a real hero do in this situation? He thought about Danielle's face when she had spoken about her father, the pain that had flickered across her features despite her professional composure. He remembered the way she had listened to him talk about Rebecca, the genuine warmth in her eyes when she looked at his daughter's pictures. Frank's phone rang, and Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Jen." "Frank, thank God. Rebecca has been asking about your FBI friend all morning. She wants to know when she can do the interview for her school project." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. "About that." "She's so excited, Frank. I haven't seen her this enthusiastic about a school assignment in months. She's been practicing questions all morning." Through the phone, Frank could hear Rebecca's voice in the background. "Is that Daddy? Can I talk to him about the hero lady?" "Frank!" Jennifer's voice was concerned now. "Is everything okay?" Frank looked at the photo of his daughter one more time, at the hope and love shining from her young face. Then he thought about Danielle, sitting alone in some hotel room, carrying the burden of her father's death and the weight of her deception. "Everything's fine," he said finally. "But I need to make a phone call first. Can I call Rebecca back in an hour?" "Of course. But Frank, is there something you're not telling me?" Frank smiled for the first time in 24 hours, feeling something like clarity settling over him. "Yeah, Jen. I think I might actually be learning what it means to be the man my daughter thinks I am." After ending the call, Frank scrolled through his contacts until he found Agent Walsh's number. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before he pressed it. "Agent Walsh? It's Frank Coleman. I need Agent Harper's contact information." "Frank, are you sure about this?" "No," he said honestly. "But I think that's exactly why I need to do it." Danielle sat on a wooden bench overlooking the park's main meadow, watching families enjoy the crisp autumn afternoon. Children raced across the grass while their parents followed with strollers and picnic blankets, their laughter carrying on the October breeze. The scene should have been peaceful, but all Danielle could think about was the look of betrayal in Frank's eyes when her cover had been blown. Her phone buzzed with yet another congratulatory message from Langley. The mission had been a complete success. The mole had been identified, arrested, and was already providing valuable intelligence about foreign infiltration attempts. Her superiors were calling it a textbook operation, and there was talk of a commendation ceremony. But success felt hollow when measured against the human cost of her deception. "Agent Harper?" Danielle looked up to see Frank Coleman approaching along the walking path, his security uniform replaced by civilian clothes that made him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. He wore dark jeans and a green flannel shirt that brought out the color in his pale eyes, and he carried a small gift bag in one hand. "Frank," she said, standing from the bench. "How did you find me?" "Agent Walsh," he admitted, stopping a few feet away. "She said you might be here." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of yesterday's confrontation hanging between them like a physical barrier. Danielle could see the uncertainty in Frank's posture, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot as if ready to flee at the first sign of rejection. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "No," Danielle replied firmly. "I'm the one who owes you an apology. I lied to you about who I was. I violated your trust." Frank shook his head. Agent Walsh explained about undercover work, about operational security. "I understand why you couldn't tell me the truth." "Understanding and forgiving are two different things," Danielle said quietly. "Yeah," Frank agreed. "They are. But I've been thinking about everything that happened, everything you told me about your father and about why you do this work." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "The pain you shared with me, the story about Lieutenant Colonel Harper, that was real, wasn't it?" "Every word," Danielle confirmed. "And when you told me I could choose to be better, that it wasn't too late to be the man my daughter thinks I am, were you just manipulating me?" Danielle felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. "Frank, I need you to understand something. I've been undercover for 3 months in this operation. I've lied to dozens of people, created false relationships, manipulated emotions when necessary. It's part of the job." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "But what happened between us in that lobby, and later in the cafeteria, that wasn't part of any mission. That was just me, responding to someone I recognized was hurting." Frank nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had hoped was true. "Agent Walsh said something similar. She said she could tell when you forgot you were undercover." "It's dangerous for operatives like me to forget," Danielle said. "It can compromise missions, endanger lives. But with you, I couldn't seem to help myself." Frank reached into the gift bag he was carrying and pulled out a small framed photograph. It was the drawing Rebecca had made, the crayon portrait of my hero daddy, but now it was properly matted and framed like a piece of precious art. "Rebecca finished her hero project," he said, offering the frame to Danielle. "She chose to write about you." Danielle stared at the drawing, her throat tight with emotion. "Frank, I can't accept this. I'm not the person she thinks I am." "Aren't you?" Frank asked. You're someone who dedicated her life to protecting others after losing her father to racism. You're someone who took time to show compassion to a bitter man who was threatening you. You're someone who saw potential for good in someone everyone else had written off. He pointed to the drawing. Rebecca spent all morning asking me questions about you for her report. She wanted to know if you were brave, if you helped people, if you made the world safer for kids like her. What did you tell her? The truth, Frank said simply. That you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. That you help people even when they don't deserve it. And that because of people like you, little girls like Rebecca can grow up in a world where they're safe to dream about becoming doctors. Danielle accepted the framed drawing with trembling hands, studying Rebecca's careful artwork. She drew you standing together with her. Like a family. She asked if you might come to dinner sometime, Frank said, his voice soft with nervous hope. I told her I'd have to ask you first. Danielle looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of lingering resentment or mistrust. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like the beginning of love. Frank, you need to understand what you'd be getting into. My work requires long absences, dangerous assignments. I can't always tell you where I'm going or when I'll be back. I know, he said. Agent Walsh explained about operational security. But she also said that CIA operatives are allowed to have personal lives, people they care about outside of work. And you think you could handle that? The uncertainty, the secrets. Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. 6 months ago, I would have said no. I would have been too insecure, too controlling. But you helped me see that I'm capable of being better than I was. He gestured toward the families playing in the meadow around them. I want Rebecca to grow up seeing her father with someone who challenges him to be his best self. Someone who represents the values I want to teach her about courage and service and standing up for what's right. Danielle felt the last of her emotional defenses crumbling. I'm scared, she admitted. I don't know how to be in a relationship where I can't control all the variables. Neither do I, Frank said, taking a step closer. But maybe we can figure it out together. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he took her free hand in both of his. I know I have work to do on myself. Years of bitterness and prejudice don't disappear overnight. But I want to do that work, and I want you to help me. Frank. My daughter believes in heroes, he said urgently. Real ones, like you. And maybe, if I work hard enough, someday I can be worthy of being called a hero too. Danielle looked into Frank's eyes and saw not the broken, bitter man she had first encountered, but someone who had chosen to embrace hope over hatred, growth over stagnation. Someone who reminded her that even the most damaged hearts could learn to love again. Rebecca's teacher assigns a lot of projects, she said finally, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. What do you mean? I mean, she's going to need help with them. Research assistants, interview subjects. It's a big responsibility. Frank's face lit up with understanding. Are you saying? I'm saying yes to dinner, Danielle said. And yes to helping with homework. And yes to seeing what happens when two people who've been hurt decide to trust each other. Frank's smile was brighter than the autumn sun. Rebecca's going to be so excited. She's been planning the menu all morning. What's she making? Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. She says it's hero food because heroes need comfort food after saving the world. Danielle laughed, the sound carrying across the meadow and mixing with the laughter of the children at play. She sounds like a wise little girl. She gets that from her mother, Frank said. But maybe, if we're lucky, she'll get her sense of justice from you. As they walked together through Piedmont Park, Frank's hand warm in hers and Rebecca's drawing tucked safely under her arm, Danielle realized that sometimes the most important missions weren't the ones that made headlines or earned commendations. Sometimes they were as simple as teaching a broken man that he was worthy of love, or showing a little girl that heroes came in all colors and could be found in the most unexpected places. 6 months later, Rebecca's next hero project would feature a security officer who had learned to see past differences to find common humanity. But that's a story for another day. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose love over hate. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories that prove the power of human connection.